Okay, so let's have a look at your questions for discussion board 6. Um, so the first question is from James. James asks, the communicative language teaching approach emphasizes the teacher's role as a facilitator and guide. This facilitator helps students in their negotiation for meaning. Without a classroom setting, is CLT a viable approach, one-to-one instruction? And that's what James is talking about. Can student-teacher communication produce genuine linguistic interaction, or are additional interlocutors necessary? Well, let me say that perhaps one of the most vital communicative activities in the language classroom is the interaction of teacher and student. Remember, sometimes that can often be lost because the teacher's often more concerned with form rather than communication. So we have the classic example of a particular exchange between teacher and student in which which can be characterized as um, initiation, response, and feedback. So, what did you do this weekend? Um, the teacher asks. Student says, um, I went. I played soccer and broke my leg. Teacher responds in terms of the evaluation of that response. Good. Why do they say good? Well, formally, it is correct. The student used the right tense, etc., etc. Notice that is not responding to the content or the communicative value of what is being said. So, vitally in the classroom, we are engaged in meaningful interaction. And so that is one of the essences of the most powerful part of being a teacher is to involve oneself in these kind of communicative activities with students. So they're meaningful and not just focus on the formal features of whether the student's getting the tense right or using the right word, etc., etc. So if you think of that in a one-on-one situation, then we have a great opportunity in those situations to involve ourselves in highly meaningful interaction and find a lot about the student. So, in many ways, if if we had the opportunity to go one-on-one with students, we would really be putting into practice communicative language teaching. Um, we can bring other people into the classroom as we would do in a normal classroom in an individual situation by exposing students to different listenings, different accents, different registers, etc. In the normal way we would do that in a normal classroom. Okay, next question is Anthony. Using the principle of autonomy can be a great tool to have students take the initiative in the classroom and be active members in the team that you as a teacher are coaching along. This offers a lot of gray area because of the opposing fear that you may be giving up too much control to the class, that the class drifts from the exercises planned. How can you manage this? Adults would seemingly handle this autonomy better than youth, but can you trust children and teens with this responsibility, or do their hands need to be held more? Yeah, it's an excellent point, and you're more or less answering the question yourself here. It is the problem of creating a balance between autonomy and teacher control, between autonomy and chaos in many ways. Um, so, for example, let me just give you an example of what would be autonomy if you invited students to bring in their music to class and to play that music and to use it as a source of material. Now, that's a great thing because it validates the student. But as a novice teacher, beware because they may be bringing in music which is very hard to listen to. which is mixed in a way so that the vocals are difficult to hear, and it may have particular content that you are not particularly want to share with the rest of the class. Think of certain rap music, etc., certain misogynistic lyrics, etc., etc. So, in that sense, that little anecdote is trying to show the perils of autonomy in a sense. So, it's speaking to what you're saying there of trying to balance the two. So, when you're talking about autonomy, certainly ask students to bring in their music, to play in class, but listen to it first. Similarly, you might want to set up particular kinds of activities which allow students to create materials, and this works very well for reading comprehension. So you ask a students in turn to prepare a reading comprehension, bringing into class a particular copy of a particular reading text that they're particularly interested in. Now, there are ways of doing that where you structure it and you edit it and you monitor it, so you make sure that what students are bringing into class is going to be suitable to be shared with other students. So that speaks to the kinds of things you have to do. And autonomy has to be managed, as you suggest, to get the best out of it. Bailey says, assuming that autonomy is indeed the thing that we're working to encourage the most in students, what can I do to encourage student interest in the language outside the classroom and to ensure that students are becoming as autonomous as possible when it comes to using the English language? Well, there's two parts to that question. The second part, of course, to become as autonomous as possible is is asking a lot. That's a big question. But in terms of the first part of getting students to uh, use their interest in language outside the classroom, which is a bit more tangible. I'm going to talk about EFL situations. We're talking about teaching English in a country where there's very little, apparently, interaction with with English. So that becomes a very big question, and it requires a lot of creativity on part of the teacher to actually explore and look at the kinds of exposures to language in a foreign language situation that you can encourage your students to do. First thing, obviously, this day and age, we have the fantastic resource of the internet, and we have the fantastic library. And I say it's a fantastic library because it has to be compared with great ancient libraries, the British Museum, the great Library of Alexandria of Antiquity, the great Library of Timbuktu. That is YouTube. And as teachers, we can begin to explore that library and then begin to give students particular clues as to kinds of ways that they can navigate the vast resources there in terms of their interests. Other aspects of language outside the classroom. I'm just going to go to one extreme here, and this is an anecdote I had from a student one time who was studying French in Ohio, and one of the ways that she connected with the language and made it real outside of the classroom was reading her aunt's perfume bottles. So our aunt had a lot of great interest in French perfume, and these had a lot of French on the back of them. Now that's interesting because language is kind of found in lots of different situations like that, and it's up to us as teachers to kind of make those connections between for our students with the way they exist in the external situation. As you drive around any foreign town, foreign to us, if you drive around Japan, for example, you see lots of examples of English. It's another part of the written system, and it's very interesting to collect examples from signs, from advertising of English language words. So that's another way you can make connections, and these are tasks you can give students to explore. Okay, next question is from Casey. Casey asks specifically about the 12 principles of that Brown discusses And her question is, which teaching principle would you rely on? Do you have any suggestions for working with large classes? Okay. So a couple of things there, and I think we've got another question on large classes coming up soon. So let me talk about the principles and which principles would you rely on. Um, so here are the um, here are the oh, what's going on here? Yeah, we've got another question about the 12 questions, and this is from Catherine. All the 12 of the teaching principles are very important to teaching a second language. However, if you could only choose a few, or if you're able to implement a few, which ones would be the most important? Which ones would have the most impact on students if they were included or not included? So let me respond to that specific question from Catherine, and then we'll get back to the larger question of larger classes that Casey asked, and we're going to have another question on large classes in a moment. So if we look at those 12 principles, I've kind of put the principles that I think that I would pull out as being the most important in red. And I guess the most important one would be meaningful learning. And meaningful learning involves meaningful communication. Everything that it works in the classroom has to be meaningful. What is meaningful, of course, is there to be discovered. It's there to be discovered as an interaction between what is meaningful for the teacher and what is meaningful for the student. So we work together to create those meaningful situations in the classroom. Once we have something meaningful, then we can talk about the notion of communicative competence, because when something's meaningful, it has communicative value, right? So what did you do this weekend? Oh, I played soccer and broke my leg. Oh, really? Oh dear, tell me about that. What, well, how did it happen? So what we're doing is exploring, and we're using all our resources to negotiate meaning and to focus on that which is really has high communicative value, and that's meaningful learning and communication. Um, Connected with that, I think, is the notion of risk taking, because if we're really attempting to communicate, we need to take risks. We need to focus on the communicative activity rather than on the formal requisites of getting particular grammar correct, tenses correct, use of the right article, etc. So encouraging that kind of atmosphere in the classroom is very goes along with the notion of meaningful learning and meaningful interaction in terms of communication. And I've highlighted the other one there, the language culture connection, because I think it's very important. And goes back to what we talked about before of in terms of activities outside of the classroom where students connect with language, is to make a connection between the language and the culture, because this really feeds into the notion of motivation. A lot of our students don't choose to study English. They have to, because it's the dominant language, and they don't fall in love with the language in the way that we possibly can, because we don't have to study Italian or Japanese or French, or we can choose. Um, so helping students to make connections between the language in the classroom and what is meaningful as a cultural representation, whether it is in music or whether it's in some cultural domain that the student can connect with, whatever they're interested in, and they can see the connection between that culture and the language, is very much a part of helping create the motivation, the intrinsic motivation to be a good language learner. Okay, so yeah, going back to the I thought I had this here, but we haven't. This is the notion of large classrooms. Is that two things? You've experienced large classrooms in at OU when you've done a class that has maybe 200, 300 students in it, right? Um, One of the things you probably noticed that those particular classes can work well or not well depending on how good the actual teacher, the instructor, is at lecturing. And lecturing is kind of a skill that not many of us have. And that's the ability to project and engage a large number of people in a particular auditorium. So, one particular approach to this is recognizing who you are as a teacher. Do you have those skills to engage people in those large situations? Very few of us have that ability. So recognizing that you have it is one great thing. If you got it, use it. If you don't have it, then you're going to avoid those kinds of situations where you're going to talk for 10 minutes about grammar. Oh, come on. If you're not good at lecturing, that's not going to be interesting. It's not going to be meaningful. Um, so who are you as a person? And the large classroom is the particular standard situation in throughout most of the world. One particular approach to that is the the goldfish bowl approach. That is where you bring out a small number of students in the beginning of class to the front of the class, and you begin to interact with that particular group, and the rest of the class has a particular listening task where they have to listen to what's going on in that small group, and then you can get a new group of students to come down and work with them. Um, as in all classrooms, lots of changes of pace are between uh, teacher oriented and then group work and pair work. Okay, thank you for those comments, and I look forward to discussion board 7.